Speaking of tense relationships, let's now look at the NATO. Cracks seem to be appearing in NATO's united front. There seems to be two distinct factions emerging. On one side are the Eastern European nations. They're determined to see Ukraine join the alliance. The nations are informally known as the Bucharest Nine. Leaders of the Bucharest Nine met in Slovakia's capital, Bratislava, on Tuesday. They were joined by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The Eastern European nations had one demand: Ukraine needs to become part of NATO as soon as possible.
It is also clear that Ukraine should really become member of NATO. The question is when, and the answer is shortly or immediately after the war. Because only the full membership, not a half membership, but only the full membership of NATO can guarantee the peace in Ukraine and guarantee the peace in Europe.
Ukraine cannot be left in the gray zone anymore. We cannot risk a war in Europe again. Of course, we expect Sweden to become NATO member before we all meet in Vilnius. I have a strong feeling that it is still possible to achieve. I also have a special plea to allies to complete the process of ratification. There is no reason to stall the process right now. Let us unite our efforts so that 32 countries can sit at the NATO table in Vilnius.
The promises we make should also be kept. We have to give perspective for Ukraine's membership application to the NATO. And in order to be able to move forward in that sense, we have to see the soonest end to the war conflict in Ukraine.
It seems the Bucharest Nine are upping the stakes. The former head of NATO and current advisor to Zelensky, Anders Rasmussen, has issued an ultimatum. He said Ukraine needs security guarantees and a membership path at the next NATO summit. The summit will begin on July 11th in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Rasmussen said if these steps aren't taken, there will be an escalation. He said Poland and the Baltic nations might take matters into their own hands. How? By sending their own troops into Ukraine. Yes, NATO members are apparently threatening to send their soldiers into the war zone. It would mark a huge escalation and risk direct involvement of NATO troops in Ukraine. Remember, NATO follows the principle of collective defense. An attack on one member is an attack on all. So what happens if Russia kills NATO member country soldiers while attacking Ukraine? Rasmussen's threat is being seen as a pressure tactic, a way to arm twist the other faction in NATO, the cautious faction. This includes Germany and the US. They are reportedly still wary about letting Ukraine join the alliance too soon. It could serve to anger Russia further. Current NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg seems to be attempting a fine balancing act. He made these two statements in Bratislava.
All allies agree that NATO's door remains open, that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, and that this is a decision that only allies and Ukraine can make. Russia does not have a right to veto NATO enlargement. At the B9 meeting today, we prepared a NATO summit, which will take place in Vilnius in July. At that summit, I expect allies to agree a multi-year package of assistance, so that Ukraine transitions from Soviet-era doctrines, training and equipment to NATO standards, and to help it move closer to the alliance.
On one hand, he said Russia does not have the right to veto a NATO enlargement. On the other, he spoke of a multi-year assistance package, something to help Ukraine move closer to the alliance. He did not commit to Ukraine immediately joining NATO. Then yesterday, he said NATO must give security assurances to Ukraine when the war ends. Assurances, not membership. He also reiterated that NATO will provide full-fledged security guarantees to full members only. It's this kind of cautious approach that's making the Eastern European nations angry. It threatens to divide NATO. the US seems to have noticed the tense situation.
The President will welcome Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, to the White House on Monday, June 12th, to discuss the upcoming NATO summit that's going to be occurring in Lithuania. President Biden and Secretary General Stoltenberg will review preparations for the summit, including the work to further strengthen allied deterrence and defense, build on the 2014 Wales Summit Defense Investment Pledge, and deepen NATO's partnership. They will also discuss ally support for Ukraine in the face of Russia's brutal war of aggression.
So will Washington give in to Eastern Europe's pressure, or will it stick with a cautious approach? We'll bring you more on this story as it develops.